Welcome back to the Daryl Dixon versus Michael Myers battle and who will win. Before we dive into the analysis, please remember to subscribe to my channel to support me. Thank you very much.
The storm had swept through the small town of Haddonfield like a wild beast, leaving behind an eerie silence. The rain continued to fall, heavy, icy drops lashing against Daryl Dixon's face as he propped up his dilapidated motorcycle under the awning of a ruined gas station. His worn, weathered leather jacket was soaked, his long hair clinging to his angular face. The hunter's blue eyes narrowed, observing. This town wasn't right. There were no growls of the undead, no cries for help. Only emptiness, a thick stillness like a shroud. The smell of blood lingered in the damp air, not the familiar stench of decaying corpses, but the pungent scent of freshly spilled blood. Daryl drew his crossbow, the weapon that had accompanied him through countless hells on Earth, loaded an arrow, and began to move. His booted feet moved lightly on the crumbling asphalt, blending into the night like a shadow. He found the first corpse in a grocery store. A middle-aged man lay on his back, his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. A single, deep, and chillingly precise stab wound in his chest. Not a zombie's claw mark, not a looter's bullet wound. This was the work of a pure murderer. Daryl's instincts, honed since the early days of the apocalypse, screamed a warning in his mind. Something else was here, a predator. His own breathing suddenly became too loud. Daryl hid behind a crumbling shelf, listening. Nothing. But he knew he wasn't alone. A chilling feeling of being watched ran down his spine, an invisible pressure weighing down the air. He moved to the back of the store, where a door led to a narrow alley. A flash of lightning illuminated the alley for a split second. He was there, tall and silent as a stone statue. A lifeless white mask, a dark blue mechanic's jumpsuit. In his hand, he held a long kitchen knife, its steel blade dripping with rainwater mixed with blood. Michael Myers. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, his black eyes behind the mask like two bottomless pits draining away all light and hope. Daryl's reaction was instantaneous. The crossbow bolt shot up, the arrow whizzing away with a sharp whoosh. But in that fleeting flash of lightning, he moved, not to run, but a decisive backward step into the darkness, swallowing his massive frame. The arrow embedded itself in the wooden wall behind him, where he had just stood. Daryl cursed, immediately retreating in the opposite direction. This wasn't a zombie, this was something far worse. The chase began in the rain-soaked night. Daryl weaved through alleyways, climbed fences, using every piece of his knowledge of the terrain he could observe, but the masked killer was like a ghost. He was always right behind him, unhurried, yet never left behind. Daryl leaped over an old generator, his body tumbling onto the muddy ground. The killer appeared right where he had been standing, his knife descending into the air. A second slower, and Daryl's head was severed from his neck. Daryl rolled, drew his hunting knife from his belt, and plunged it straight into the man's thigh. The blade went in, up to the hilt. A normal man would have collapsed, but Michael Myers didn't even flinch. He just bent down to look at the wound, as if it were a minor inconvenience, then advanced again. Daryl's eyes widened. "What the hell are you?" he roared, yanking his crossbow and firing a close-range shot. The arrow lodged in his shoulder, piercing through flesh. Michael staggered a step, but didn't stop. For the first time in years, Daryl Dixon actually felt fear. He scrambled to his feet and ran like hell. It wasn't a retreat, but a tactical withdrawal. He needed time. He needed space to think. Somehow, he managed to get out of the sparse woods on the edge of town. Sitting beneath a large tree, gasping for breath, Daryl looked at the bloodstains on his knife. It was his blood, but he seemed completely unharmed. His hunter's instinct shifted from fight to analyze. He was stronger, more resilient, and seemingly impervious to pain. So, what was his weakness? That night, Daryl didn't sleep. He prepared. This was no longer a fight between man and man, or man and monster. This was a battle between a hunter and the embodiment of death itself. And a hunter had to set traps. The forest became Daryl's battlefield. He dug spike pits, embedding sharpened wooden stakes soaked in flammable tree sap. He strung tripwires, attaching automatic crossbows to tree trunks. He was no longer trying to kill him, but to slow him down, to injure him until he couldn't stand anymore. The battleground was ready, and all he had to do was wait. That morning, dawn broke gloomy and gray. Daryl stood in the middle of the forest and yelled, "Hey, you masked freak, I'm right here." His shout tore through the silence, echoing among the trees. And then he came. Michael Myers emerged from behind an old oak tree, unhurried, like a serene god of death. The knife was still in his hand. The arrow in his shoulder was broken. Only a stub of the shaft remained. Daryl began to step back, luring him in. He took the bait. As Michael stepped into the first clearing, a tripwire sprang up, wrapping tightly around his leg and hoisting him upside down into the air. Immediately, an arrow from an automatic crossbow shot out, embedding itself in his stomach. Daryl didn't celebrate. He drew his crossbow and fired 2 more shots into his chest. Michael cut the rope, falling to the ground like a sack of bricks. Dark blood oozed from multiple wounds, but it only took him a few seconds to get back on his feet. The hunt continued. Daryl led him through a series of traps. A spike pit collapsed beneath Michael's feet, wooden stakes piercing through his calves and thighs. A tethered tree trunk sprang back, slamming into his chest with incredible force. Each attack was a fatal blow. His bones must have been shattered, his internal organs crushed. But after each fall, he got back up, slower, more rigid, but still moving forward. His jumpsuit was shredded, his mask still expressionless. His breathing, the only sound he made, grew heavy and raspy, like rusty bellows, yet showed no sign of fading life. By this point, Daryl understood the horrifying truth. He couldn't be killed. Not by arrows, not by traps. He wasn't hunting a beast anymore. He was trying to wear down a hurricane. Fire was his last hope. Daryl lit a fire starter and threw it into the last spike pit where Michael had just fallen. The tree sap ignited fiercely, engulfing the tall figure in a sea of flames. The sizzling sound of burning flesh filled the air. Michael walked out of the fiery pit, his entire body a living torch. He didn't scream, didn't struggle. He just slowly, one step at a time, advanced toward Daryl. Daryl froze for a moment, utterly horrified. He turned and ran. The battle in the woods was over. He had to take him somewhere else. The final plan formed in his mind when he saw the old sawmill on the outskirts of town. A massive, rusty metal structure with giant machines and, most importantly, an industrial wood chipper still connected to a diesel-powered backup generator. This was no longer a hunt. This was an execution of a machine. Daryl stood on the factory's iron floor, the wood chipper's roar like a metal beast. The giant blades spun wildly, ready to shred anything that fell into them. Sweat, rainwater, and blood mingled on his face. He checked his crossbow one last time. Only 1 arrow left, and his hunting knife. That would be enough. He arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The factory's large door was pushed open, a massive shadow stretching long under the moonlight. His clothes were charred black, his body riddled with fatal wounds. Yet Michael Myers' stance remained defiant and menacing. The knife was still in his hand, its steel blade reflecting the firelight from the old furnace in the corner of the factory. They lunged at each other one last time. Daryl fought like a cornered wolf. He dodged powerful knife strikes that could cleave an ordinary man in two. He used his crossbow as a shield, blocking a slash and smashing it hard against Michael's mask. A piece broke off, revealing part of the face beneath it. A lifeless eye, charred black skin, yet nothing that looked human. Daryl shivered, but his hands did not stop. He drew his knife, stabbing repeatedly into his side, then his stomach. Michael grabbed his neck, lifting him into the air. His hand was like a steel vise, crushing Daryl's throat. His air supply was cut off. Daryl struggled, his eyes rolling back. In desperation, he spotted the last arrow he had rigged into a makeshift crossbow, tied to the iron railing. Using his last ounce of strength, he raised his leg and kicked hard at the trigger mechanism. The string snapped, and the crossbow launched the arrow straight into Michael's wrist, the very hand crushing his throat. The force of the shot nearly severed his hand. Michael's fingers loosened. Daryl dropped to the floor, coughing violently. Michael looked at his nearly severed hand, then advanced again. But Daryl had enough space. He rolled, then ran along the narrow walkway leading to the chipper. Come on, you bastard," he croaked, his voice hoarse. Michael charged after him. They were on a narrow iron platform, directly above the wood chipper's massive hopper. The wind from the blades whipped around, creating a small vortex that pulled everything into its maw. The fight was now a ballet of death. Daryl dodged left, then right, trying to lure Michael into position. But Michael was no fool. He had learned how Daryl fought. He feigned a lunge, then abruptly changed direction, cutting off Daryl's escape. They grappled on the very edge of destruction. Michael's knife plunged forward, Daryl spun, and the blade carved a long gash across his arm, blood spurting profusely. The pain made him reel. Michael grabbed his shirt, pulling him close, preparing to deliver the killing blow. In that moment, Daryl Dixon made the craziest decision of his life. He didn't back down. He lunged straight into his enemy, wrapping his arms tightly around Michael Myers' massive body, reeking of blood and burnt smoke. The sudden charge threw Michael off balance. Daryl used his entire body as a battering ram, sending both of them tumbling off the iron platform. They were in freefall, but Daryl had planned. He had already secured a chain to his leg, its other end hooked to a support beam. As they fell, the chain tightened, violently yanking Daryl's leg, leaving him suspended just above the grinding maw. Michael Myers, however, had no such anchor. His dark eyes, for the first time, seemed to flicker with a spark of realization as his body plummeted straight into the roaring machinery below. A gruesome sound filled the air. Metal ground against bone and flesh, mingled with the roar of an overloaded engine. Blood and debris splattered everywhere. Daryl, hanging upside down, witnessed the entire horrific scene. The grinder slowed, groaned, and then exploded, unable to process what was inside it. A small tremor shook the entire factory. Daryl was thrown against the wall by the blast, and everything went dark. He didn't know how long he had been unconscious. When he woke up, everything around him was a living hell. The factory was ablaze, steel girders had collapsed, and diesel fuel burned everywhere. The pain from his arm and all over his body reminded him that he was still alive. Daryl struggled to his feet, stumbling out of the inferno. Through a shattered window, dawn had arrived. Orange and pink stained the sky, as if the sky itself was bleeding. He stood there, gasping for breath, watching the factory collapse amidst the roar of the flames. No one, nothing, could have survived to walk out of that hell. Daryl Dixon had won. He was the last survivor. He had defeated something that shouldn't have been defeated, not by brute force, but by an iron will to survive, and a plan that cost him everything. But as he dragged himself towards his motorcycle, he felt no triumph. Only a vast emptiness, a bone-deep weariness, and a chilling truth remained. This world was full of nightmares, and he had just survived one of them. At the end of the road leading out of town, as the first rays of sunlight warmed his grimy face, he stopped. He pulled from his pocket a fragment of the pale white mask he had picked up during the fall. It was still stained with black blood. Daryl looked at it for a long moment, then threw it into a muddy puddle by the side of the road. He started his engine, its roar tearing through the silence of the dawn, and sped off, disappearing at the edge of the horizon. Days later, another group of survivors passed by the smoldering ruins of the sawmill. They found a footprint, a large footprint, deeply etched in the gray ash, led from the wreckage deep into the dark forest. And when they looked closer, they saw that the print was only from 1 foot, as if the one who left it was no longer a whole person, but still kept moving. In the early morning fog, in another town, far away from that place, a boy frantically ran into the police station, reporting a tall, limping man standing silently in his backyard. In his hand was a kitchen knife. Michael Myers had never truly died. His figure, the nightmare in human form, was still out there, waiting for the next night. And Daryl Dixon would continue his journey, a solitary hunter in a world without rules, the only one who knew that sometimes victory wasn't about ending evil, but simply surviving to tell the tale.
What do you think about this fight? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thank you all very much.